I'm kind of batching it this week. I don't know how long it's been since I had to sleep alone in my own house, but my wife went to Texas to visit with our daughter. She took our other daughter and our grandson, and she's down there visiting with our daughter and her two little girls. That's one of the things she enjoys the most, is caring for these little girls, even though I think sometimes they drive her nuts. One is 7, the other one's 4, but she's down there. And I was thinking about my daughter and something she revealed to us that had happened to her in the past few months, actually. She was in high school a closet country music fan. I mean, I found out that she and her boyfriend, who she later married, were country music fans, but when you go to Glendale High School in Springfield, Missouri, you really don't spread that around a lot. In fact, one day I drove her to school, and I was in a station van that had our call letters on there and the fact that we were a country music station, and she said, do you think you could just drop me off a couple of blocks from school so my friends don't see this? She was into old-time country music, of all things. I know I took her to see Johnny Cash one time, and she was just thrilled, and a lot of the other older acts were the ones she really liked. And she lives in Austin now, if you're familiar with Austin. I always said if Nashville and Branson were jewelry stores, Austin would be the gold mine, because that's where a lot of this stuff originates. And they have a big festival down there that we were privileged to go babysit for our granddaughter, so our daughter and son-in-law and others could go to the South by Southwest Festival, which he said has, I don't know, that number sounds awfully large, but 3,000 bands converge on the city for this week-long festival. And so she's down there. But she told us recently, she said, I just discovered George Strait. She says, where has he been all my life? I love George Strait. Now, some of you recognize that name because George Strait is probably one of the most, arguably the most successful country singer in the history of the genre. I gave a sermon, I don't think I gave it here, on names and how the country music establishment, when you're really famous, you don't need a last name. You're Elvis. You know who I'm talking about when I say Elvis? Or Garth? Or Reba? Or Dolly? Except for George. Because the two probably top guys ever in country music, their first name is George. George Strait and George Jones. But she discovered George Strait. And she's been listening to country music all these years, and he had his first number one song, I think, when she was in 2nd grade. And now she's going to be 40 next week. She's the baby of the family. But, so I got to thinking about George Strait. Now, if you need a title for this sermon, you could call it George Strait and Mrs. Dorsheimer. That's provocative, isn't it? Not that the two know each other. I doubt that Mrs. Dorsheimer, I don't know if she even knows who George Strait is. But we'll talk about her later. But George Strait, I got to thinking, what is so special about George Strait? He's good looking, but there are a lot of good looking guys out there. He's a good singer. He's a great singer. A lot of great singers out there. If you've ever been to his shows or anything like that, he's not an outstanding entertainer. I mean, he gets up there and sings his songs and everybody loves it. There was a movie that he starred in a few years ago, and I forgot the name of it, but he played the part of a country music superstar, much like George Strait. I'm amazed that he did it because of the content of the movie. This superstar, who became tired of the showbiz life, just disappeared. Just took off, hitchhiked down the road or something, and went back to Texas to get closer to his roots and left everybody hanging. They had a show to do in Shreveport or somewhere, and he's not there. I forgot what his name was in the movie. I think it was Dusty or something, but Dusty disappeared. What were they going to do? And what they did, they found a guy who was in his crew who was built pretty much like he was. And they dressed him up in his clothes, put a big cowboy hat on his head so you could hardly see his face, had him go out on stage and blew a lot of smoke across the stage, if you've seen that, and he lip-synced all the stars' songs, and nobody knew the difference. And I thought, I've been to George Strait concerts. You could almost do that with George Strait because he hardly says a word, and he sings those songs so well that he's so familiar. What makes George Strait so great? Well, I came up with one word, and it's really the title, I guess, for this sermon, if you want a title. It's integrity. Integrity. George Strait has had number one songs. The first one, I think, was in 1982, maybe 83. But that continues up almost to the present day. That's unprecedented. One thing about George Strait is he sounds like a country singer. I go back to, I'm a traditionalist when it comes to country music, and my career in country radio goes back to the mid-'60s. And I get in arguments with my fellow traditionalists sometimes. They say, well, country music ain't like it used to be. It sounds like rock and roll today. I don't think so. Back in the 60s, that was when country music was really country. Now, if you were around back then and familiar with what was going on, it was called the Nashville Sound. And it was a dressed up form of country music. They discovered multi-track recording where they could take a small group of people, put them in a studio or bring them in separately and record tracks. So they could take two fiddles, turn them into violins, and sound like a symphony orchestra as they multi-tracked it, as they played, 16 different parts. They could take 4 singers and make them sound like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And so you had these big arrangements, and the image of country music that they were trying to project at that time was, I call it Eddie Arnold in a tux at Carnegie Hall, because that was what country music was becoming, the Nashville sound. More urbane, more dressed up than it had been back when it was cowboy and hillbilly music. If I had played George Strait back in the 60s, I would have been reprimanded by my employers because they would have said, look, this isn't what country music is about anymore. This guy wears a cowboy hat, he wears jeans, he wears boots, he sings through his nose, he uses fiddles and steel guitars and all these things they used to use, yes, back in the past, but this is modern country music. Well, George Strait was different, and there are others who have also maintained a certain amount of integrity in that department. I think of Brad Paisley and some of these other guys who are traditionalists. But back then it was, if you went down the radio dial and tried to find a country station, you really had a hard time because so many of the country stations were playing pop singers like Dean Martin and Al Martino singing country songs because they didn't want to sound too country. We used to use the term, because we were traditionalists, the company I worked for, we used to call it country, but not so bad you'd notice. And you had Glenn Campbell, who was being played on the pop stations, and Eddie Arnold and some of these other people. Today, if you go down the dial, you pretty much can tell which stations are country because it is more distinctive. But anyway, George Strait, integrity. George Strait, as far as I know, with one possible slight exception, all of his songs were stone cold, hard country. And he maintained that. So he is, I think, in a contemporary sense, in a musical sense, certainly I don't know much about his personal life because he really apparently lives a fairly simple personal life, fairly as normal as you can be when you're George Strait. It's hard to go see him anymore because I don't think he does concerts because he doesn't have to. And the most recent ones he did were in huge stadiums where he drew capacity crowds. But I think George Strait's greatest asset is his integrity, which is what I want to talk about today. Of course, I want to talk about a deeper form of integrity. I looked it up in the dictionary, and it means an adherence to moral and ethical principles, soundness of moral character. I don't know if that applies to George Strait. Honesty, I think it does. Sound, unimpaired, or perfect condition, which I think his music represents in the form of country music. It's sound, it's unimpaired, it's pretty straight ahead, and it's, I think, in perfect condition. Being a traditionalist, I'd, of course, say that. There are certain facets of integrity that I'd like to look at today, and look at some of the, I got my paperclip caught here. Some of the various things that go to make up integrity. By the way, there was a study done to see how much integrity there is in this world. Hopefully not much of this applies to us, But they asked a bunch of people, what would you be willing to do for $1 million? Or no, we're talking small change here, $10 million. The big bucks. Kind of reminds me of a guy who was trying to seduce a young woman and said, would you sleep with me for $1 million? And she said, well, yeah, I guess I would. And he said, well, how about $10? She said, of course not. What do you think I am? He says, we've already determined what you are. We're just haggling over the price. But what would you do for $10 million? 25% of those responding said they would be willing to abandon their entire family. I've seen some families where maybe that's a good idea, but they'd be willing to do it for money. Others said they would be willing to abandon their church for $10 million. That's real money. Would you? Hopefully not. Some would be willing to become prostitutes for a week or more. Others would give up their American citizenship. These are percentages. 16% said that. Others would leave their spouses. Of course, a lot of them do that anyway. And others would withhold testimony and let a murderer go free. Others said they would kill a stranger for $10 million. What's your price? So this sort of shows the status of integrity in our society today. People will do all kinds of things for a mere $10 million. Of course, when you're talking about salvation and God's kingdom, that is a small price. But some of the elements of integrity are, one is honesty. Honesty is a part of having integrity. Turn to Proverbs 6, verse 16. Proverbs 6:16. We'll begin in verse 16. And these are several things. Of course, this is a sermon in itself. There are 6 things the Lord hates. 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue. A lying tongue. Something that God truly hates when we're liars. And that's fairly common. I think there's a book out called The Day America Told the Truth, and gives some outlines of how many lies we tell. I don't have the facts with me here. I'm preparing another sermon on that. But some of the common lies and the little white lies, and how many times the average person lies in a day. A lot of that going around. There are some fairly common lies. The check is in the mail. You ever said that or heard that from somebody? The check is in the mail. I'll start my diet tomorrow. We service what we sell. I just went through a thing with my cable provider and had to spend well over an hour on the phone trying to get something fixed in my TV. Finally begged them to send a tech out to fix it, which they did, and he fixed it in a matter of minutes. But we service what we sell. Give me your number and the doctor will call you right back. I think doctors are more sensitive today than when this was taken. Money cheerfully refunded. One size fits all. Not in my present condition. This offer is limited to the first 100 people who call. And have you ever seen those ads? And they have a little countdown, and you've got 20 seconds or maybe 20 minutes to respond to this. And as it goes on, it ticks down. I've heard this one. Your luggage isn't lost. It's only been misplaced. Leave us your resume and we'll keep it on file. It hurts me more than it hurts you. Oh, really? How come I'm feeling the pain then? We just need 5 minutes of your time. Have you ever had that? Your table will be ready in a few minutes. Open wide. This won't hurt a bit. Has your dentist ever said that to you? Let's have lunch sometime. Usually that's the way of blowing you off. I'm not going to set a date. Sometime we'll get together and do that. It's not the money, it's the principle. These are some of the big lies that we tell from time to time. Proverbs 13 and verse 5. Proverbs 13 and verse 5. The righteous man hates lying. You hate lying. But a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. We should hate lying. It's something God hates. If we have the mind of God, we're going to hate lying. It's going to be something that's going to be abhorrent to us as it is to God. Just across the page in my Bible, Proverbs 12 and verse 7, the wicked are overthrown and are not. The house of the righteous shall stand. A man shall be condemned according to his wisdom, but he that is of a perverse heart shall be despised. Perverse heart. Somebody who's a liar, somebody you just can't trust. And down in verse 17, get a little away from myself. He that speaks the truth showeth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is that speaks like the piercings of a sword, and the tongue of the wise is health. When we're wise, when we're honest, that's healthy. That's a good thing. The lip of truth shall be established forever, the lying tongue but for a moment. Usually our lies get found out. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, and of the counselors of peace is joy. There shall no evil happen to the just, but the wicked shall be filled with mischief. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. We covered that earlier. But he that deals truthfully is a delight. When we're honest, that's delightful to God. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of the fool proclaims his foolishness. Sometimes there is a time to just not comment. There's a time to just be silent. There's a time to just, I sometimes will say, yeah, I know, but I'm not going to tell you. When people want to know dirty little secrets. Revelation 22 and verse 14. And again, we're talking here about honesty, about the opposite of that which is lying. Revelation 22 and verse 14. Blessed are they which do his commandments. They may have right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city. Great reward. The other end of that voyage we heard about in the sermonette. For without are dogs and sorcerers, whoremongers, murderers, idolaters, and whoever loves and makes a lie. When we lie, when we enjoy liars, when we don't want to deal with the truth. Matthew 5 and verse 33. Matthew 5:33, part of the Sermon on the Mount. When I say to you that whosoever shall put away his, let's see if I've got the right place here. 33, again, you've heard it said in the past by them of old that thou shalt not forswear thyself, you shall perform unto the Lord your oaths. But I say to you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Neither shall you swear by the head by your head, because you can't make one hair white or black. Let your communications be yes, yes, or no, no. For whatsoever is more than that comes of evil. So, is our yes enough? Or do we have to, as we would say as kids, swear on a stack of Bibles, or whatever. Stack of Bibles this high, and everybody's stack would get higher. It isn't just yes good enough or no good enough. And again, I usually quote country songs for something, but there are some country songs usually about daddy, that daddy could be trusted. You could do it on a handshake. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jimmy Dean. He was a country singer back before he went into the sausage business. And I never really had a warm feeling about Jimmy Dean. I don't know. He just seemed to be kind of folksy and down to earth, but a little bit phony. And he spoke to a seminar I was at one time about his sausage business. And he said, we do everything on a handshake. We don't have contracts. We just agree. And I thought, well, nice if you could do that. He says, notice this, and he was talking to a bunch of broadcasters and music professionals. He said, if you have a song that's worth maybe $20,000 that you have written, you've got a stack of legal documents maybe that thick to protect it. He says, go to Wall Street sometime. Well, you may not like Wall Street, but his point was, go to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and people there are exchanging millions of dollars just with a flick of their wrist, just by raising their hand, just by their word. And, so do we have that kind of integrity, that kind of honesty where when we say yes, we mean yes. When we say no, we mean no. And it's so important in raising kids. I know my wife got really frustrated with our granddaughter a few months ago when they were up here, and I think there was some popcorn in the car, and one was throwing popcorn at the other. And my wife said, don't do that, or you're not going to something. She was going to deny him some privilege. I said, are you really going to do that to these sweet little girls who are throwing popcorn around in the car? She said, well, I says, if you say it, you better do it. You better follow up on it. So she doesn't make those kind of claims anymore, unless she means to keep them. But so often we threaten, don't we? We threaten. Have you ever threatened your kids? Stuff like that? And there's some really bizarre threats that are made sometimes, things we say we're going to do to our kids. But we should be known and trusted for our honesty. Above all people on the face of the earth, we should be known and trusted for our honesty and our integrity. James 5 and verse 12. James 5 and verse 12. When I find it. James 5:12. But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yes be yes, let your no be no, lest you fall into condemnation. So again, we should be known for our few words. When we say yes, it should mean yes. When we say no, it should mean no. And we shouldn't have to swear on a stack of Bibles or whatever, or swear to something. And there are all kinds of things like that. We should be as good as our word. Just that one word. There are a lot of common lies that we tell, and I read some of them before, and a lot of qualifying statements that we make. Well, to tell you the truth, I was going to lie to you, but to tell you the truth, that sounds so innocent when you think that you've got to go out of your way to say, well, I'm going to tell you the truth here. What were you going to lie to me before? Or just a lot of little seemingly innocent things like that betray the fact that we don't always tell the truth. And I'm telling you the truth about that now. I really mean it. Well, if you didn't mean it, why were you going to say something you didn't mean? So we have those little qualifying phrases in our vocabularies because people don't always expect us to be honest. And sometimes maybe we're not always honest, really, truthfully. And we throw those little phrases in to emphasize that. So that's one facet of integrity. That's honesty. I heard a story, I read it a few years ago. A guy went into a restaurant and bought a couple of chicken dinners. He had a woman, this man and woman went in and did that and took them out, and they went to a park to enjoy the chicken dinners and opened the bag, and there was no chicken in there. It was filled with money. Lots of money. I forgot how many $1,000 were in there, thousands of dollars. And the man grabbed the bag, went back to the restaurant where there was utter chaos by then, and said, hey, you gave me the wrong bag. This is full of money. Gave it to the manager. The manager was overwhelmed with this guy's honesty and integrity. And he said, well, this is wonderful that you do this. People need to know how honest you are. I'm going to call the newspaper, get them over here to do a story on this. And he said, oh, please don't. He says, don't do that. He was really insistent. He says, let me tell you something. The woman I'm with is not my wife. It's my girlfriend. Isn't it great to know that there's that kind of honesty in the world today? What would you do for $10 million? Another element of integrity is singleness. Singleness. You ever meet somebody or been somebody who's, as my boss used to say, flaky as a bowl of post toasties? You know, wakes up in a different world every day. I know there's a sitcom I guess it's not on anymore, but it was called The Office. I don't know if any of you saw it. It was a fairly decent show, I guess, and it's about a bunch of people that worked in an office, and they had a manager who was like some managers I've worked with, and would come to work with a bright new idea every day. Not everyone was sound, but it was a big, usually they were big time wasters. And but I remember one episode that was particularly uncomfortable. His name was Michael Scott, and he was the district manager for Dunder Mifflin Paper Company. And early in his career, knowing that he would be successful, he went to an inner city school. I guess it was set in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and got a class of kids together, maybe 20 or 30 kids, young kids, little bitty kids, and said, if you people will stay with it and graduate from high school, I'll pay your tuition to go to college. Because he knew that by then he'd be wealthy enough to do that. He was on his way up. Well, the day came when they were getting ready to graduate, and they sent for him. Well, there was no way he was able to fulfill his promise. But not only did they send for him, when he came to the school, they had an assembly, and they were dancing and singing praises to Mr. Scott. Thank you, Mr. Scott, for what you've done for us. But then he had to admit that he didn't have the money. But it was good intentions initially, you know, and the show was like that. He'd come in and some days he'd have some just really harebrained idea. And I've worked with managers who would go to seminars and come back with some weird idea and expect everybody to fall in line. And guess what we're going to do today? But as my old boss would say, flaky as a bowl of post toasties. James 1 and verse 8, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Some people are double-minded. They're different in different circumstances. You know, you're here, you're at church, you've got your Sabbath face on. We're real nice to each other, and hopefully tomorrow or Monday, whenever we go back to work, we'll be that way to everybody else around us. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. I was a deacon in the Springfield church who used to work across the state and did various contracting work, and he was over in that other area, and there was a guy he had to work with who, boy, they didn't get along, and they were really nasty to each other, and he was nasty to this guy was nasty back, and this went on for, I guess, several weeks or months while he was doing the job, and later he ran into the guy at the feast. Both these guys were church members, so you never know. We need to be single-minded, and singleness is another form of integrity, another facet of integrity. By the way, he was despite that, of course, he told me the story. Despite that, he was a very upstanding deacon in the church, and he's since died, but very, in my own personal situation, he was very helpful to me and a very wonderful man, but did have that one episode in his life where he didn't know that the person he was being abusive to and who was being abusive back was actually another church member. Matthew 6 and verse 22. Matthew 6:22, the light of the body is the eye. Therefore, if your eye be single, your whole body will be full of light. That singleness of purpose, we need to have that. We need to have that singleness of purpose, single eye. But if your eye is evil, the whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you be darkness, how great is that darkness? No man can serve two masters. We have to set unshakable priorities. You know, who do we serve? Of course, he'll either hate one and love the other, or else he'll hold to the one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and mammon. And sometimes there comes a time when you have to tell the boss, no, I'm not going to work tonight. It's Friday, and I know a lot of people say I can't work Friday night. I always like to say I can work Friday night, but I'm not going to. I've made a choice not to. And hopefully we will own things like that. But there does come a time when we have to have that singleness of mind and have firm priorities as to what's really important. Joshua 24 and verse 14. Going back to the Old Testament. Joshua. See, that's before Judges, isn't it? Joshua 24 and verse 14. Now there's a fear of the Lord in them that serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood in Egypt, and serve the Lord. So we need to put away those other gods, those things that come between us and God, and serve God with a singleness of mind. You know, what is your first priority? Hopefully, as Matthew 6:33 says, it's we're seeking first the kingdom of God. Everything else comes second. And that's our priority. That's our single goal in life, our single most important goal. We have intermediate goals, but hopefully that overwhelming goal first is to serve God. And some of you, remember going back to, I remember going back and thinking about serving God. And back then, I think a lot of people said, well, if you serve God, you're going to be blessed. And some people were. And they drove nice cars, and they had nice homes, they had good jobs. I remember one guy, his job was threatened because he wanted to keep the Sabbath, or he was going to keep the Sabbath. They said, well, you'll lose this job if you keep the Sabbath. And his priorities had turned around a little bit. He said, well, God gave me this job. I think it would not be right for me to give it up for the Sabbath. Sometimes we need to have that clear priority that the Sabbath is important to God, and it should be important to us, and we should have that singleness of mind and action. Singleness, another facet of integrity. Also, consistency kind of plays hand in hand with singleness. Consistency. Hebrews 13 and verse 8. Hebrews 13 and verse 8. I want to present a little frightening scenario here after we read this. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. How many people have talked to you maybe about the Sabbath or the holy days or something else? And look, this is 2013. This isn't 13 AD. Things have changed. Grow up. Be modern. That's an excuse. Consistency. God is consistent. Frightening scenario. What if God wasn't consistent? What if God called you up tonight and said, tell you what, I've just rethought a few things, and I don't know that the Sabbath is really that important. And we've been told that, how many years ago, 15 years ago or so, we were told that it's just not that important anymore. And other things, this adultery thing, if you're really in love, or stealing, well, if you really need it, you should do no murder. But what if the guy's a real jerk? It needs to be wiped out. You can make all kinds of, what if God said that to you? All this that you believed for all these years and based your life on, well, I don't know if it's that important anymore. God's not going to do that because God has perfect consistency and has set this plan in motion and is consistent in carrying it out. Proverbs 24 and verse 21. Proverbs 24, verse 21. My son, fear thou the Lord and the king. Meddle not with them that are given to change. Again, have you dealt with people like that where they wake up every day in a new world and you have to deal with their changing mood, their changing temperament, maybe their changing priorities and goals? Well, we were going to do this, but let's try it a little different way now. Sometimes not for any good reason, but just to do something different. I worked for a guy like that once, and he'd come in and all of a sudden want to do something different. Why? Well, because I'm just tired of the way it is. And there is room for change. There are times when we need to change and things we need to change, but sometimes people are given to change. You get kind of bored with the same old thing. And I recently had to evaluate myself and look at my dad. I think I've talked about my dad. When I was a teenager, I thought he was boring with a capital B. He worked the same job for decades. I think from the time he was in high school to the time he retired, he worked in the same job. It was a good job, but he worked there for a long time. And then he lived in the same house from 1943, I believe it was, till he died. In fact, we had the house. We sold it, I think, earlier this year. But he lived in that same house, had that same job. He and my mother were married for over 70 years. Boring, you know. Not for a kid that's 16 years old and is looking for some adventure. That's kind of boring. But we shouldn't be given to change. By the way, my wife and I have just been married 52 years. We've lived in the same house for 40 years. And during the heart of my career, I worked for the same outfit. Well, it was two companies, but for 28 years in a job where I was read somewhere in a trade magazine where the average tenure for the average person in that position was 6 months. Boring. I guess I'm like my dad. I'm kind of boring. But I don't, there's a time for change. There's a time when we need to change. We need to change sometimes what we are. We need to change what we are. Because we find as we examine ourselves, and that's something we talk about a lot in the spring holy days, examining ourselves. Hopefully, when we see things that need to be changed, we have the guts to change them. And we're not perfect. We have to change as we go along. We need to sometimes change our direction. We don't need to do it capriciously or because, I'm just tired of doing it this way. No, God shows us where we need to change. Hopefully, if we examine ourselves, we see things and areas where we need to change. Having done all that, we need to follow through. Follow through is an important part of integrity. James 5 and verse 10. James 5 and verse 10. I'm not a very interesting person, as you can see. I'm boring. James 5 and verse 10, talking about follow through. Take my brethren the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example, suffering affliction and patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Which stay with it. Follow through with it. Too often, salvation is looked on as I think particularly in Hollywood, as sort of a wondrous instant experience. You experience salvation. You see the light in the sky or something, and sometimes they don't dwell on what happens next. I remember when I was baptized, I came up out of the water, and it was a February day in Buffalo, New York, garden spot of the earth. Well, not really, but it was a nice area we were driving. We drove home, and sun was setting, and I felt so peaceful, so at ease. I thought, now I'm God's property. I don't have to worry about anything anymore. Oh, really? I found out in a hurry that, I had to worry about a lot of things, including myself, my own attitude, because we had trials. Almost immediately, we had trials we had to deal with. I think we had our electricity shut off at one point. My car broke down, and I had to walk 3 miles to work every day because the buses didn't start running till after I had to be to work. Various things like that. So it was, it was a trial. We had to be patient. We had to endure. And we are expected to endure unto the end. To endure to the end. And have the patience of Job, as it says here. And we've seen the end of the Lord, and the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. He's going to take care of us. Galatians 6 and verse 9. Galatians 6 and verse 9. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap and will faint not. Have you seen people, if you've been in the church for any length of time, have you ever seen anybody that became weary in well-doing and said, look, particularly, I know some of you, I had dinner last night with two of our younger couples in the church. I was lonely, so I invited them out over and cooked. It's the first time I ever had to cook for some guests, more than one or two people, by myself, because my wife was gone. And so they came over, and they're all in their mid-20s, I think. And I was talking about various things. And I said, of course, you remember, no, we weren't born yet. Things that to me feel like, well, that was yesterday. And I don't know, they were asking me about my country music career, and I was dropping names of people they'd never heard of who I thought were pretty famous. But that was a long time ago. Plus, they're not country music fans. Shame on them. But we do, we do need to follow through something. I don't know how I got off on that. But turn to Galatians 6:9, where it says, let's not be weary in well-doing. Oh, yeah, going back, I was thinking back around the early 70s, when some of you who were in the church in the 60s maybe remember that there was a lot of speculation that we would be fleeing in the early 70s and Christ would return shortly after that. Now, to my knowledge, my wife disagrees with me on this. I don't remember any minister ever really setting a date. In fact, I heard the disclaimer, now we're not setting dates, but it kind of looks like. And I remember our pastor went to Pasadena for a ministerial conference, came back and said, well, we did some projections. And if you were around then, the church was growing at an amazing rate. It's like 30% every year. And he said, that the way it's growing, it looks like by the time they ran the numbers, and by I think it was 1973, which we anticipated would be the time to flee, the way the church is growing, we'll have 144,000 people in the church by then. Does that ring a bell? The 144,000 mentioned in prophecy. And so a lot of people put two and two together. And, of course, hey, we're still here. I didn't think I'd be here. I never thought I'd get this old. There's the old saying, if I knew I was going to get this old, I'd have taken better care of myself. But I didn't know I was ever going to get this old. So we have had to follow through. Again, some of you are newer. Some of you were probably around back then and in the church, and you're still here. But there were just a lot of people who have become weary in well-doing. I remember one deaconess and deacon and deaconess that were always doing things in the church, and about that time they said, well, we've done enough over the years. We're going to let some of these younger people do the work now. And they kind of stepped back from things, but they came back. They couldn't give up. They weren't ready to quit. Oh, I mentioned George Strait and Mrs. Dorsheimer. I better talk about Mrs. Dorsheimer. I don't want to leave her out. Because I have a great deal of respect for that woman, and I love speaking her name, and she knows she probably doesn't remember me or know that I remember her. Mrs. Dorsheimer was my intermediate algebra teacher in high school. And I took my final exam. This was I needed one credit to graduate, so I could go to summer school and get that. And then I could, since I was tired of people telling me what to do, my parents telling me what to do, my teachers telling me what to do, I decided I was going to go join the Army. It didn't work. I mean, I joined the Army, but I found out that the most tyrannical people I ever met in the Army weren't the officers or the non-coms, the sergeants. When I was in basic training, the most tyrannical people, the people who threw their power around the most, were the PFCs. Private first class, who were, given a task to lead these men to do dishes or something at KP, and they had power. Mrs. Dorsheimer was my intermediate algebra teacher. I took my final exam and took all of them and passed all of them, and I was delighted. School year was over. All we had to do was come in and pick up our report cards, but I knew I'd passed everything. And I got a phone call at home. School's out. It's summertime. I'm just going to have to go back there for summer school, and then I'm free. As if getting away from education is free. I found out that's not a good attitude. But it was Mrs. Dorsheimer. I said, I passed the test, didn't I? She says, oh, yes, but you missed a couple of questions. I want to see you in class. So I had to go back into school. School was empty. It was summer, the beginning of the summer vacation. She said, Donald, you missed a couple of questions, and I want to make sure you know what you missed and why you missed them. For years after that, I walked around with a Mrs. Dorsheimer chip on my shoulder, thinking, why did this cruel woman bring me in after I'd passed the exam to tell me about 2 lousy questions that I didn't get right? Well, I have a lot of respect for her now. Almost as much respect, or probably more respect, than I have for George Strait. This woman was not there just to pick up a paycheck and be in class every day to teach. She wanted to know that I knew intermediate algebra. And she was dedicated to that, and she was willing to come in during what would have been her summer vacation and teach me about those 2 questions, I don't even remember what they were, that I missed. I'm impressed now when I think back and think of what a great example she was of follow-through. And, we hear a lot of stuff about teachers and their ethics and how hard they work, and some certainly do, and she certainly did. She was there to teach me algebra, not just to have a job. And I appreciate that. That's follow-through. So we have these elements of integrity, these facets: honesty, singleness, consistency, and, of course, follow-through. Turn to Proverbs 20 and verse 7. Proverbs 20 and verse 7. The just man walks in his integrity, and his children are blessed after him. Not only will integrity be a great blessing for us, but it's also a great blessing for our children. I look at the way my dad was, and we used to talk a lot about child rearing and whether you should spank or whether you shouldn't spank or all these other things. And I am convinced that the greatest child rearing tool there is setting a good example, or setting a bad example, which is not good, but setting a good example. And again, I think my dad, he wasn't in the church. He once told me that he didn't consider himself religiously inclined, which I took offense to at first, but I thought, all the people that invent religions to fill their own needs, I'd rather some of them, that we'd probably be a lot better off if some of them just admitted that they weren't religiously inclined. But he set that kind of an example. So I hope as we go along, we'll consider this topic of integrity and how important it is. And remember George Strait and Mrs. Dorsheimer.